Welcome to part 2 of 3 for the topic Trophic Ecology. In this topic, we're going to go through the next 2 learning objectives. We're going to look at describing how primary productivity provides energy to the ecosystem and compare the net primary productivity among different ecosystems. And so here we're taking that jump from communities to ecosystems, but you'll see very quickly how related primary productivity is to food webs and keystone species. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem, as defined by your book, is one or more communities of living organisms interacting with their non-living physical and chemical environments. And so you can think of it as the community stuff we've been talking about with the added layer of physics and chemistry, right? So the sunlight, the temperature, precipitation, nutrients in the environment, things like that. The ecosystem approach emphasizes storage and transfer of both energy and matter. And so that's why it fits so neatly within trophic ecology, right? So the transfer of energy and matter is directly related to things eating each other and how those trophic connections are made. And so if we think about our ecosystem here, we have a couple of things we need to go over in terms of vocabulary. So first is primary productivity, or PP. So primary productivity is the rate at which solar or chemical energy is captured and converted into chemical bonds. So we've learned about this already. This is photosynthesis. We haven't talked about chemosynthesis, but chemosynthesis also happens particularly down in deep sea vents. Certain organisms are able to convert methane into sugars, just like plants are able to convert carbon dioxide into sugars. And so primary productivity, again, all of the photosynthesis that's happening, and the energy assimilation of plants underlies all ecosystem functions. And so all of the energy that plants take up is known as gross primary productivity. And then the gross primary productivity is divided into 2 things. The productivity that plants need to live, which is their respiration, and the net primary productivity, which is the amount of productivity that is available to the next trophic level. And in general, plants assimilate no more than 1/3 of the light energy they absorb. So that means that this NPP here is rarely more than 1/3 of the total gross primary productivity. And so if we look at this diagram down here, we have solar energy coming in from the sun. 99% of that solar energy is reflected or not absorbed. It's the wrong wavelength, so plants don't absorb it. 1% of the solar energy is captured by photosynthesis. This is our gross primary productivity. Of that 1%, anywhere from 60 to 70% of that gross primary productivity goes directly into the plant, keeping itself alive. So this is known as respiration or respired energy. 30 to 40% of the gross primary productivity is used to grow the plant. So the plant puts out new leaves, it grows flowers, it produces fruit. All of this is producer growth and reproduction, and that's net primary productivity. That's the productivity that is available to the next trophic level. And in general, these productivity units are measured as kilojoules per meter squared per year, or watts per meter squared, and a watt is 1 joule per second. And so they all involve some unit of energy, some unit of area, and some unit of time. We can measure primary productivity in a number of different ways. There are a number of different tools out there for doing this. One of the most common that you'll see in ecosystem labs is using an infrared gas analyzer like those pictured on the right here. So this is a Lycor IRGA, and what it does is it measures the carbon dioxide in versus the carbon dioxide out in sunlight, which is representative of the net primary productivity, and in dark, which is representative of respiration. And then, as was on the previous slide, GPP equals NPP plus respiration. And so all you have to do is kind of add these 2 numbers together to get your gross primary productivity. harvest and measure dry mass. So this is another way. This doesn't involve any fancy tools. All you have to do is go out at the same time each year and harvest a bunch of plant material, and let's say you go out and collect 10 leaves, and then you dry it out, get all the water out of it, and measure the mass, and then you go out the next season, collect 10 leaves, and see how much you get for your dry mass again. And so the idea here is you're comparing dry mass, and the more dry mass there is, it means the higher the productivity was. And finally, remote sensing, which we'll talk about more in a second. You can use satellites to measure the wavelength reflectance. So if a particular area has a lot of plants, it's going to be reflecting a lot of green wavelengths, and you can use this to correlate to net primary productivity. The more green in an area, the more you expect there to be more productivity, and you can use remote sensing to detect this. In addition to measuring the primary productivity, you can also look at the secondary productivity, and so this is the productivity of consumers, things that are eating your producers or your plants. And consumers are not perfectly efficient either, so just like the plants, they lose a lot of energy along the way. They lose it in terms of things that they just can't assimilate. So egested energy is energy that they consume but is never built into their body, so they never absorb that energy. So you can think about this as like fiber, right? So high fiber diets, you ingest a lot of the things that you eat. Assimilated energy would be all of the energy that you are able to assimilate from your food, but that, similar to plants, gets split into respired energy, which is the energy that you need just to keep yourself alive, and secondary productivity, net secondary productivity, which is the energy that you use for growth and reproduction. And so the assimilated energy minus the respired energy equals the accumulated consumer biomass, and that is your net secondary productivity. And this net secondary productivity is extremely highly correlated with net primary productivity. And so on these two graphs here, you have terrestrial and aquatic habitats, and you have net primary productivity on the x-axis, and you have secondary productivity on the y-axis. And you can see really nice tight curves here, where the more primary productivity you have, the more productive your consumers are going to be, because there's more plant life for them to consume. And so this is a kind of common sense relationship here. The other common sense relationship that I want to remind you of is endotherms, which are regulating their body temperature, respire a lot more than ectotherms, and so the proportion of their energy budget that goes to respiration is much higher, whereas ectotherms can devote more of their assimilated energy to growth and reproduction. So we expect ectotherms, for the amount of energy consumed, we expect ectotherms to have higher net secondary productivity compared to endotherms. If we look at one of those remote sensing figures that I mentioned, where we've used satellites to detect the amount of productivity in a given region, you can see a couple of patterns jump out at you. And so if we look at this satellite image here, we have net primary productivity indicated by the deepness of the color green, and so the darker that color green is, the more productivity there is. The closer to white it is, the less primary productivity there is. And one thing that should jump out at you is that the tropics are particularly productive on land. And so why are the tropics so productive? There are a bunch of reasons, and you've probably thought of a bunch while we've kind of been looking at this image, but here they are. So there's intense sunlight, right? If you think back to the beginning of the semester, the solar equator is between the tropics at all times, right? So you have plenty of sunlight for plants to do their thing. You have warm temperatures year-round, which gives you a really long growing season, which again allows for plants to produce more than they would in places with more seasonal temperatures. You have abundant rainfall, again thinking about how the Hadley cells work and all the rain is being dumped right here around the solar equator. And In most areas, you have abundant nutrients or ample nutrients because you have high decomposition rates, and so nutrient cycling is moving pretty quickly, and plants can get those nutrients when they need them. You compare that to the temperate zones, so the northern latitudes here, which are a little less deep green, there's still production happening, but that production is happening primarily in the summer. And then if you go even further north, production is quite low to non-existent. So this gray color means that there's no production. And you can see that, part of that is due to low winter temperatures. So there's just a period of the year where plants can't do any productivity because the temperature is too low. And because winter nights are really long, that also decreases the amount of time for photosynthesis. And so this is kind of this interesting pattern where the tropics are highly productive, and as you move away from the equators, north or south, you end up with lower and lower productivity. You have some areas like deserts that have zero productivity just because the conditions are so harsh. It's really hard to be a plant in this environment. And then you have other areas where it's so cold and so dry that it's really impossible for plants to get much production done. When you look at the oceans, so this is the exact same type of remote sensing map, but now we're looking at the productivity in the oceans. So we're reading the oceans for the same reflectance, right? Where do we see this really large green reflectance? And here, this is indicated by deeper shades of red. Deeper shades of blue are going to be where there's no primary productivity. And so you should notice right away that all of the high productive areas in the oceans are right off the coastlines, right? This is really interesting. So most of photosynthesis in the oceans is occurring really close to shore. And out in the open ocean, this is like a desert, right? There's not much going on out here in terms of plant life. And if there's not much plant life, it means there's not much of anything else either, because everything depends on the plants. If you go back to the beginning of the semester when we looked at ocean circulation and we talked a little bit about upwellings, you'll also notice that a lot of these highly productive areas are near areas of upwelling. And so these are places, again, remember, where the winds and surface currents are blowing waters offshore, and those waters that are getting blown offshore are replaced by deep waters which bring nutrients and oxygen with them, and that allows these areas to be highly productive. And so when we're thinking about why coastal regions are so productive compared to open ocean, it has partly to do with nutrient runoff from the land, so getting lots of nutrients from river systems and running off into the ocean. It also has to do with these upwelling areas bringing nutrients up from deep water. And the open ocean, on the other hand, is not close to those nutrient sources and has a very limited surface area that gets sunlight. The rest of the open ocean is too deep for sunlight. And so you end up with what nutrients are available in the form of other dead organisms very quickly sink to the depths and are kind of left there for deep sea organisms to consume or for upwelling to bring up near coastal areas. One of the more interesting things to come out of studying kind of ecosystem ecology and the net primary productivity of different ecosystems is that we might expect that tropical rainforests and other tropical environments are going to give us the most productivity we could imagine. But in reality, it turns out that swamps and marshes are the most productive environments on Earth. And so here we have a bunch of our different ecosystems, so terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. And you have your net primary productivity in grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And you can see that swamps and marshes far outstrip tropical rainforests, and coral reefs also are kind of right in line with tropical rainforests. And then salt marshes are not that far behind coral reefs and tropical rainforests. And so this is a really interesting pattern, and it kind of makes one wonder why salt marshes are so productive. And so the first thing is they have actually really high exposure to the sun. And so if you look at this image of a salt marsh here, a salt marsh is really flat. All the plants have really good sunlight accessibility. There's not a lot of plants that grow tall and shade out other plants. So all the plants are kind of getting maximum sunlight. there's lots of water. They're in a salt marsh. Most of these plants have adaptations to process the salt out of the water, so they are never lacking for water. So it is salty water, but they can process that out. That means that diversity is pretty low. So you'll notice that there isn't a lot of difference in these plants. This is probably all the same grass species in the background here, this light green grass species. So diversity is low because of the salt, but they have a lot of water. And there's a lot of decomposition going on. So you have a lot of soil microbes that are decomposing very quickly, and that releases nutrients into the soil. And so the salt marsh is extremely fertile soil compared to the wet tropics, where a lot of those nutrients get washed away in the heavy rains. In the salt marsh, they get trapped in the mud, and the plants are able to take those nutrients up and use them to maximize their productivity. If we think in general about what limits primary productivity in all of these different ecosystems, like why tropical rainforests are so high compared to some of the other terrestrial ecosystems, it generally boils down to two things, temperature and moisture. So these are our two climate variables. And so net primary productivity, if you plot the net primary productivity of an ecosystem versus its mean annual temperature, you see a nice positive relationship here where the warmer your ecosystem is, the more productive it's going to be. That makes sense, right? We need at least a temperature above 0 in order for plants to be able to photosynthesize. And so if your mean annual temperature is above 0, you're in pretty good shape in terms of productivity. However, productivity is also limited by moisture. Plants need moisture, as we discussed way back in the beginning, because in order to do gas exchange, they have to leave their stomata open. That means that they're losing water, and they have to replace that water. So here's the relationship between net primary productivity and mean annual precipitation. And notice that it's a little more interesting than between NPP and temperature. We now have this hump-shaped curve where not enough rain is bad, but too much rain is also bad. And there's some intermediate amount of precipitation each year that plants do the best at. And so the downside here, the reason why having too much rain is bad, is what I was saying before, what's going on in the tropics, is you can have nutrient runoff when you have too much rain. And so the rain actually leaches a lot of those nutrients out of the soil, away from the plants, and that reduces productivity. There's also some limitation by soil nutrient availability, and this is why fertilizers work. So they've done a lot of studies looking at the net primary productivity ratio between net primary productivity with added nutrients and net primary productivity control with no added nutrients. And so when you look at this ratio and you compare different habitats, when you increase either nitrogen or phosphorus, you end up with an increase in NPP. And when you increase both nitrogen and phosphorus, you often end up with a dramatic increase in NPP in those environments. It depends on which environment you're in. But this suggests that all of these terrestrial environments are nutrient limited in addition to being temperature and precipitation limited. Aquatic primary production is also limited by temperature, not as much by precipitation because it is aquatic, but instead it's limited by light because not the entire aquatic ecosystem gets light, only the surface layers, and much more heavily by nutrients. So if temperature and light are similar between different aquatic ecosystems, then primary productivity is entirely limited by nutrient availability. And just like on land, the two nutrients that plants are most limited by are phosphorus and nitrogen. And so you have this experiment down here where again they're looking at these are your freshwater ecosystems and your saltwater ecosystems. And in all cases, when you add either nitrogen or phosphorus alone, you see a slight bump in net primary productivity, and often you see a massive bump when you add nitrogen and phosphorus together, so particularly in lakes and in the deep oceans, and then depending on the other environment, so wetlands, stream bottoms, lake bottoms, the effect is greater or lesser. Too many nutrients are bad. This is how we end up with eutrophication. So eutrophication is a process where you have an algal bloom. The added nutrients cause the algae to completely take over, and so the lake turns green, kind of like this lake over here. And this is really bad because then what happens are the algae, while they're alive, are producing lots of oxygen, but because there's so many of them, they're dying at a really high rate. And the bacteria at the bottom of the lake are eating all that dead algae. And because there's so much dead algae, the bacteria are doing really well. And the bacteria actually consume all of the oxygen in the water body. And when that happens, you have all of your other aerobic organisms, so all of your other organisms that depend on oxygen, end up dying. And so eutrophication is most commonly associated with images of dead fish, right, in a lake with lots of green algae on the surface and lots of dead fish floating. And this is what's happening. Your algae bloom, the algae die, bacteria eat the dead algae, consume all the oxygen, and all of your other aerobic organisms like fish end up suffocating in the lake. This was tested in a really cool experiment in the 1970s in Canada. The Canadian scientists went around to a bunch of lakes and they built these barriers here, and they actually fertilized one half of the lake and left the other lake normal. And so you can see here kind of the biomass of phytoplankton and the when they started fertilization and when fertilization ended, and then these different colors refer to the types of nutrients they added. And so the blue is the control, so that's this side of the lake where nothing was added. The orange is where carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus were added. And then the purple is where just carbon and nitrogen were added. And so you can see they had the strongest algal bloom when all three nutrients were added. And that occurred about 3 years after fertilization. And then algae stayed high until fertilization ended in 1980. And then things dropped back down towards regular levels. And you can see kind of an intermediate response with just carbon and nitrogen. And so this was one of the experiments that was able to really show this relationship between nitrogen and phosphorus and algal blooms. Finally, oceans are further limited by silicon. Silicon, as we talked about earlier, is really important for diatoms in order for them to build their shells. And diatoms are a primary producer, and so primary production in an ocean is only going to go as far as the diatoms are, and diatoms need that silicon. And then iron is really important in the metabolic pathways of many of the ocean plants. And so without enough iron in the ocean, you end up with not a lot of productivity.